It was late, past midnight. I was sitting at my desk with the lamp on and the house quiet around me, the way it gets in spring when the crickets have started, but the frogs have not. I had Mark open in front of me, not a study Bible, not a commentary, just the text. I had been reading through the whole gospel that evening, beginning to end, the way you read a letter from someone who has something urgent to tell you. Mark is short. You can read the entire thing in about 45 minutes if you do not stop to look anything up. I got to chapter 16, verse 1. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome buy spices to anoint the body. Verse 2. Very early on the first day of the week they go to the tomb. Verse 3. They ask each other who will roll the stone away. Verse 4. They look up and see the stone has already been rolled away. Verse 5. They enter the tomb and see a young man in a white robe sitting on the right side. Verse 6. He tells them not to be alarmed. He says, Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Verse 7. Go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Verse 8. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And the text stops. I sat there looking at it. I turned the page because I assumed there was more. There is more in the Bible I was holding. 12 more verses, 16, 9 through 20. The appearances of the risen Jesus, the Great Commission, the ascension, speaking in tongues, handling serpents, immunity to poison. All of it right there, printed on the same page in the same font, with the same verse numbers. But I had been reading scholarship on this for months, and I had known for a while, the way you know something you have not yet made yourself face, that those 12 verses were not written by the person who wrote the rest of the gospel. Mark is the oldest gospel. Scholars are in broad agreement on this. It was written approximately 65 to 70 AD, roughly 35 years after the crucifixion. Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source. They copied from it, rearranged it, added to it. Mark came first, and the first gospel, the earliest written account of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, ends at chapter 16, verse 8, with women running from an empty tomb, afraid, silent, telling no one. That is where it ends. That is where it always ended. Let me show you how we know. The two oldest complete manuscripts of the New Testament that exist in the world are the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. The Codex Sinaiticus dates to approximately 330 to 360 AD. It was found in 1844 at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai by a German scholar named Konstantin von Tischendorf. It is now held partly in the British Library, partly in Leipzig, partly in St. Catherine's itself. You can read it online. The entire manuscript has been digitized. The Codex Vaticanus is slightly older, approximately 300 to 325 AD. It has been in the Vatican Library since at least 1475, when it first appears in a catalogue. It may have been there longer. It is one of the most carefully produced manuscripts of the ancient world. Both of these manuscripts contain the Gospel of Mark. Both of them end Mark at chapter 16, verse 8. There is no verse 9. There is no verse 10. There is no Great Commission, no appearance to Mary Magdalene, no speaking in tongues, no handling of serpents, no ascension. The text ends with the women fleeing the tomb in fear, and then the next gospel begins. Now here is what stopped me when I first read about this. It was not just the manuscripts, it was the testimony of the men who had access to manuscripts far older than the ones that survived. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing around 325 AD, roughly 260 years after Mark was composed. Eusebius was the first great historian of the church. He had access to the library at Caesarea, one of the most important Christian libraries in the ancient world, founded by Origen, maintained and expanded over generations. Eusebius had access to manuscripts we will never see, copies of copies of copies that are now dust, and Eusebius stated explicitly that the accurate copies of Mark ended at 16:8. He said that the longer ending, verses 9 through 20, was absent from almost all the Greek manuscripts he had examined. Almost all. Not some. Not a few obscure copies. Almost all. Jerome, writing at the end of the 4th century, the man who translated the Bible into Latin, producing the Vulgate that would be the standard Bible of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years, confirmed the same thing. The majority of Greek codices he had access to did not contain Mark 16:9 through 20. Think about what that means. The two men in the ancient world who had the broadest access to early manuscripts of the New Testament, Eusebius and Jerome, both said that the ending you read in your Bible was not in the copies they considered reliable. These are not modern scholars with an agenda. These are church fathers. These are the men the church honors as foundational authorities on the text of the Bible, and they told you, in their own writings, that Mark 16:9 through 20 was a later addition. Now I need to take you inside the text itself because the manuscript evidence is only half of the case. The other half is what happens when you read the Greek. Every author has a fingerprint, a way of constructing sentences, of choosing words, of building rhythm. You do not notice it consciously, but it is there, and trained scholars can identify it the way a forensic analyst identifies handwriting. Mark has a distinctive style. He is terse. He uses kai, the Greek word for and, to connect almost everything. His sentences are short. His vocabulary is limited compared to the other gospel writers. He repeats words and constructions, and he uses certain verbs in very specific forms. One of those verbs is poreuomai, to go, to travel, to proceed. Throughout the entire Gospel of Mark, from chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 16 verse 8, every single time this verb appears, it appears in a compound form. Mark always adds a prefix. Eis poreuomai, to go into. Ek poreuomai, to go out. Pro poreuomai, to go before. He never uses the simple, unprefixed form. In Mark 16:9 through 20, the simple form of poreuomai appears multiple times, without the prefix, in the same text attributed to the same author. That is a fingerprint mismatch. It is like finding a different handwriting in the middle of a letter. But there is more. In Mark 16:9, Mary Magdalene is introduced with a description from whom he had driven out 7 demons. This description is necessary if the reader does not know who she is, but the reader of Mark already knows who she is. She appeared in 1540. She appeared in 1547. She appeared in 16:1, 8 verses earlier. She was just named. Why is she being reintroduced as if for the first time? Because the person writing 16:9 was not the person who wrote 16:1. The new writer picked up the narrative at a point where the original had stopped and introduced the characters fresh, because he was not continuing the same composition. He was appending to it. The vocabulary shifts, the grammar shifts, the sentence structure shifts. The reintroduction of a character who was already present in the narrative is the kind of seam that textual critics are trained to identify, and in this case, the seam is visible to anyone paying close attention. Mark 16:9 through 20 was not written by Mark. Now I need to walk you through what is actually in those 12 verses, because this is where the weight of it becomes real. Verses 9 through 11. Jesus appears first to Mary Magdalene. She tells the disciples they do not believe her. Verses 12 through 13. Jesus appears in a different form to 2 of them while they are walking in the country. They tell the others they do not believe them either. Verse 14. Jesus appears to the 11 as they are eating. He rebukes them for their lack of faith and stubbornness. Verses 15 through 16. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. That is the Great Commission as it appears in Mark. The command to evangelize the entire world. Verses 17 through 18. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people and they will get well. Verse 19. Jesus is taken up into heaven and sits at the right hand of God. Verse 20. The disciples go out and preach everywhere, and the Lord works with them. Stop and think about what depends on those 12 verses. The Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation, is the foundational text of Christian missions. Every missionary organization, every evangelistic campaign, every church planting movement that has cited Mark 16:15 through 16 as its charter is citing a verse that was not in the original gospel. Speaking in tongues. There are approximately 67,000 Pentecostal and charismatic churches in the United States alone. The global Pentecostal movement numbers in the hundreds of millions. The practice of glossolalia, speaking in unknown languages as a sign of the Holy Spirit, draws its scriptural authorization from multiple New Testament texts, but Mark 16:17 is one of the anchoring verses. Handling of serpents. I grew up in East Tennessee. I know about the serpent-handling churches, the Church of God with signs following, small congregations in Appalachia, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, where believers handle live rattlesnakes and copperheads during worship services based on Mark 16:18. People have died doing this. They died obeying a verse that was added to the gospel by someone other than the author, drinking deadly poison without harm. Mark 16:18 is the only verse in the New Testament that makes this specific claim. The ascension of Jesus, as described in Mark 16:19, he was taken up into heaven and sat at the right hand of God, is one of the most concise statements of a doctrine that became central to Christian theology, the physical ascension of Jesus and his enthronement at the right hand of God. Every one of these teachings exists in the 12 verses that were not written by Mark. I am not saying these ideas do not appear elsewhere in the New Testament. Some of them do, in different forms. What I am saying is that Mark 16:9 through 20 is the compact, concentrated version that gives them all in one place: the appearances, the commission, the signs, the ascension. Remove those 12 verses, and the oldest gospel ends with an empty tomb and frightened silence. That is a different gospel than the one most Christians think they are reading. I need to tell you about Earl. Earl was on the deacon board with me at our church for 11 years. We were not close the way some people are close. We did not take vacations together, did not call each other on birthdays, but we sat next to each other at Wednesday meetings for over a decade. We organized the fall fish fry together 3 years running. We took turns driving the church van when the youth group went to camp. He is a good man, solid. The kind of man who shows up early and stays late and does not talk about it. Last October, I think it was a Thursday evening, Earl showed up at my front door. I had not seen him in a while. Not since I stopped going to the church. He was standing on the porch with his Bible in his hand, open like he had been reading it in the car before he got out. He said he needed to talk to me. I let him in. We sat in the kitchen. He had his Bible open to Mark 16. He said, "Howard, listen to me. Mark 16. He rose. He appeared. He ascended. It's right here in black and white." I could see where he was pointed. Verse 9, the beginning of the longer ending. I did not want to do what I had to do. I had thought about this moment, not with Earl specifically, but with someone like Earl, someone who still believed the way I used to believe. I had imagined it going different ways. In some versions, I was calm and persuasive, and the other person nodded slowly and understood. In the real version, sitting at my kitchen table with a man I had known for over a decade, I felt sick. I told him. I told him about the manuscripts, about Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, about what Eusebius said, about the Greek, about the fingerprint. I kept it simple because Earl is not an academic, and neither am I, and you do not need to be one to understand the evidence. The evidence is plain. His face changed while I was talking. Not anger. I was expecting anger, or maybe argument, or maybe the kind of dismissal that people use when they want to stop hearing something. Earl did not do any of that. His face went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from the inside. He closed his Bible. He put both hands flat on the table for a moment, the way you do when you are steadying yourself. Then he stood up and left. He did not say goodbye. He did not say he would think about it. He did not say I was wrong or right. He just left. That was 4 months ago. I have not heard from Earl since. I see him at the hardware store sometimes on Saturdays. We nod at each other. That is it. I do not blame him for the silence. I know what it feels like to have something you have built your life on start to shift under your feet. I know the specific kind of grief that comes not from losing something you loved, but from learning that the thing you loved was different than you thought. Earl built his faith partly on those 12 verses. The risen Jesus who appeared and commissioned and ascended. The signs that follow believers. I cannot give those back to him. I cannot unknow what the manuscripts say. That is the cost, not for me. I have already paid mine. For the people around me who did not ask for what I found. Now I need to show you the evidence that the early church knew Mark 16:8 was a problem and tried to fix it. Because they did not just add one ending, they added three. The first ending is what scholars call the shorter ending. It appears in a handful of manuscripts and reads like a brief liturgical summary. But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself sent out through them, from east to west, the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. That is it. 2 sentences. Clearly a bridge. Someone who found 16:8 intolerable and wrote the most compact possible resolution. No appearances, no commission, no signs. Just a quick summary that the message was delivered. It reads like a patch. The second ending is the longer ending. Mark 16:9 through 20. The 12 verses I have been discussing, this is the one in your Bible. It is longer, more detailed, compiled from material that resembles Luke, John, and Acts. The appearances, the commission, the signs, the ascension. It was added by a different hand, at a later point, and it became the dominant ending in the Byzantine manuscript tradition, which is why it ended up in the King James Bible and in most Bibles you have encountered. The third ending is the strangest one, and it is the one most people have never heard of. The Codex Washingtonianus, also called the Freer Codex, held at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., dates to approximately 400 AD. It contains the longer ending, but between verses 14 and 15, it contains an additional passage that appears in no other manuscript. Scholars call it the Phreologion. In this passage, the disciples respond to Jesus' rebuke in verse 14 by offering an excuse. They say that this age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over unclean spirits. They ask Christ to reveal his righteousness now. Jesus responds by saying that the years of Satan's power have been fulfilled, but other terrible things are approaching. He says he was handed over to death for the sake of those who sinned, so that they might return to the truth and sin no more, that they might inherit the spiritual and incorruptible glory of righteousness in heaven. This passage is a third author, someone who read the longer ending, itself written by a second author, and felt it needed correction. The disciples' response to Jesus in verse 14 seemed too flat, so this third hand inserted an apology and a theological explanation. Jerome knew about this passage. He cited it in his work Contra Pelagianos in the early 5th century. 3 endings, 3 different hands, 3 attempts to fix what Mark wrote. The multiplication of solutions is itself the proof of the problem. Nobody could accept that the oldest gospel ended the way it ended. Nobody could accept that the first written account of the life and death of Jesus concluded with women running from a tomb in terror, telling no one what they had seen. So they wrote endings. And the endings disagreed with each other because they were not recovering something that had been lost. They were inventing something that had never been there. Spinoza never addressed Mark 16 directly. That was not his focus. His work in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus was concerned primarily with the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and with the broader question of how to read sacred texts as human documents produced in specific historical circumstances. But the method he developed in chapters 7 through 9 of the Tractatus is the tool that resolves the Mark 16 question 300 years before modern textual criticism formalized the verdict. Spinoza's principle was this: when multiple versions of a text exist and those versions differ, the reader must identify the oldest recoverable layer and treat the additions as what they are, human interventions made after the fact, for purposes that can be identified and understood. That is exactly what happens with Mark 16. The oldest recoverable layer is 16:1 through 8. The additions, the shorter ending, the longer ending, the Phreologion, are human interventions. Each one was produced for a purpose that can be identified. The shorter ending was produced to provide a brief resolution. The longer ending was produced to harmonize Mark with the resurrection appearances in the other Gospels. The Phreologian was produced to soften the harshness of verse 14. Each edition solves a different problem. None of them recovers something that was lost. Spinoza would say, let the text interpret itself. If you let Mark interpret itself, if you follow the Greek, the vocabulary, the sentence structure, the flow of the narrative, the text tells you where it ends. It ends at 16:8. Iphobunto gar, for they were afraid. That is where the author stopped writing. Now here is the larger question that Spinoza's method forces you to face. If the 12 verses that contain the resurrection appearances, the Great Commission, the speaking in tongues, the serpent handling, and the ascension were added later by a different hand, if the oldest gospel did not include a visible narrated resurrection, then what does that mean for the foundation? It does not mean the resurrection was not believed. Paul wrote about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul wrote before Mark. The belief was there before Mark wrote. But Mark, the first person to write a connected narrative of the life and death of Jesus, chose to end his story without narrating a resurrection appearance. He chose to end with an empty tomb and silence. That is either the most profound literary decision in the history of Western civilization, or it is evidence that the earliest narrator knew something different from what later narrators would claim. Spinoza would not tell you which one it is. His method does not answer theological questions, it answers textual ones, and the textual answer is clear. Mark 16:9 through 20 was not written by Mark, it was added later. And for approximately 3 centuries, the most careful copies of the Gospel preserved the original ending, the one that ends in fear and silence. I keep coming back to that evening, the lamp on, the house quiet, Mark open on my desk. 16:8. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Ephobunto gar. In Greek, gar means for or because. It is a conjunction that connects a statement to a reason. Ending a sentence with gar is unusual, but not impossible in Greek. Ending an entire book with gar is, as far as scholars can determine, unprecedented in surviving Greek literature. No other ancient Greek text of comparable significance ends on that word. Mark ended his gospel on a conjunction that explains fear. He did not end with triumph. He did not end with the Great Commission. He did not end with Jesus ascending in glory while his disciples watched. He ended with 3 women running away from an empty tomb, too afraid to speak. Maybe the ending was lost. Maybe the last page of the scroll was damaged, and what followed 16:8 was destroyed before anyone could copy it. Some scholars believe this. It is a reasonable hypothesis, but even if it is true, it means that the ending we have, the 12 verses of the longer ending, is not the lost original. It is a reconstruction by someone who was not there and did not know what Mark had written. It solves the absence, but it does not restore what was lost. Or maybe Mark meant to end exactly where he ended. Maybe the first person to write the story of Jesus, the person closest in time to the events, the person who wrote 35 years after the crucifixion, when people who had known Jesus were still alive. Maybe that person knew that the tomb was empty and nobody understood what that meant. And maybe he wrote the truth of that the women came, that the tomb was empty, that they were told he was risen, and that they ran away in fear and said nothing. No appearance, no commission, no ascension, just an empty tomb and the terror of what it might mean. And then, generations later, other hands added what they needed to be true. The appearances, the instructions, the signs, the glory. 12 verses that transformed a story about silence and fear into a story about triumph and mission. I am sitting at my desk. It is late. The lamp is on. Mark is open to 16:8. The 12 verses that follow are printed on the same page, in the same font, as if they belong there. They do not. That is where it ends. That is where it always ended. The oldest gospel closes with an empty tomb and frightened women running in the dark. Everything else was added by someone who could not bear the silence. Make of that what you will.